A racist woman insults a black soldier on a plane, but when she watches the news the next day, she realizes she made a huge mistake. The waiting area at Chicago O'Hare International Airport was already churning with restless travelers on a wet, blustery morning in November. Roving announcements pierced through the low hum of conversation, each reminding passengers to check their gates, watch their belongings, or verify last-minute schedule changes. Under the fluorescent lights, a broad mix of people, families with strollers, business-suited professionals, backpack-toting students, converged at Gate H-17. The flight to Atlanta, initially scheduled for 9 a.m., had been delayed, stirring dissatisfaction among many. At the center of one cluster of first-class passengers stood Julia Prescott, a 30-something corporate executive who wore a tailored gray blazer and pencil skirt. Her blonde hair was pinned back with an elegant silver barrette, and her black pumps tapped anxiously on the floor. Julia's face bore the frustration of someone used to snapping her fingers for immediate results. She was heading to a highly anticipated management conference, where she planned to charm her way into a high-profile promotion. As she scrolled through emails on her smartphone, each an urgent message from colleagues expecting her to deliver perfect budgets and presentations, Julia tried to drown out her own impatience. Finally, the crackling overhead speaker announced that first-class passengers could board. Julia exhaled, relieved that she'd soon escape the chaos. Clutching her designer handbag and a glossy tote stuffed with her laptop and files, she walked briskly down the jet bridge. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was a cozy bubble of extra-wide seats and champagne flutes. Julia claimed seat 2A, stowing her bag in the overhead compartment. She made a show of checking her phone's screen once more, scanning for messages labeled urgent. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a crisp army uniform appeared near the front of the cabin, scanning the row numbers. The name patch on his chest read D. Parker. With measured politeness, he nodded at Julia, then pointed to the seat beside her, seat 2B. Julia's green eyes flickered with annoyance. She acknowledged him with a stiff smile, though a swirl of unspoken judgment spun in her head. I wonder if he's here on some courtesy upgrade or discount. I paid top dollar for my seat. Her prejudice whispered, he's probably not even paying full fare. Feeling put out, she sank into her plush seat and snapped her seatbelt, her body language declaring that she had zero intention of making friendly small talk. Once Daniel Parker settled into his seat, he offered a polite nod toward Julia, but she turned pointedly toward the window. The flight attendants glided down the aisle, offering pre-departure beverages, sparkling water, orange juice, or perhaps a mimosa. One attendant, noticing Daniel's uniform, paused and said, "Thank you so much for your service, Sergeant. Please let me know if you need anything." Julia couldn't hide her frustration. Of course, she thought bitterly. The extra perks for the military. Everyone tripping over themselves to say, "Thank you." Her lips pressed into a thin line as she reached for her phone and pretended to be busy. She'd never considered herself overtly racist. In fact, she boasted to friends that she was colorblind. Yet in moments like this, especially when her own privilege or sense of entitlement felt threatened, she found herself quietly resenting people she deemed undeserving. A short while later, with first-class passengers settled, the cabin doors closed. As the plane taxied away from the gate, Daniel discreetly pulled a small photograph from his jacket's inside pocket. Julia noticed this out of the corner of her eye. It was a picture of a smiling child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a sparkly headband and holding a soccer ball. Unable to restrain her curiosity-turned irritation, Julia said coolly, "Cute kid, your daughter?" Daniel turned toward her, surprise flickering across his features. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. That's my daughter, Kayla." Julia almost rolled her eyes at the ma'am. She was by many accounts proud of her successes, yet she found herself irritated. "Huh," she said, then added, with a note of sarcasm, "She must be proud her dad's in uniform. You traveling home from duty or something?" "I'm actually heading to Atlanta to see her," Daniel replied simply. Julia's nerves were already raw, and something about the way Daniel didn't elaborate provoked her further. She felt compelled to poke. "Must be nice to have the airline upgrade you," she said pointedly. "You're in first class, right?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I paid for this seat myself. I'm not looking for free handouts, if that's what you're suggesting." His calm but firm tone bristled against Julia's unspoken biases. She inhaled, forcing herself to appear unfazed, though inside she felt resentful at being contradicted. Tucking an earbud into her right ear, she prepared to retreat behind her music and cut off further conversation, despite the burning swirl of disapproval simmering inside her. Mid-flight, the cabin lights dimmed as attendants began serving the lunch meal, salmon or pasta, accompanied by a side salad and a warm bread roll. Julia requested a glass of Chardonnay, hoping it might quell the subtle anger roiling in her chest. She glanced over at Daniel, who politely declined the wine offered to him. When an attendant handed him a tray, she again expressed gratitude for his service, reminding him that any beverage of his choice would be complimentary. Julia couldn't hold back any longer. She angled herself toward Daniel. "Don't you ever get tired of people fawning over you just because you wear a uniform?" she asked, her tone dripping with a hostility she couldn't fully articulate. His brow furrowed. "I appreciate the kindness, but I don't ask for special treatment." "Really?" Julia countered. "Because it sure seems that everyone goes out of their way to remind you how grateful they are. Meanwhile, the rest of us work just as hard, but don't get free upgrades or freebies." Daniel set down his fork. "Ma'am, if it bothers you that much, I can pay for my own meal. It's not a big deal." His voice was controlled, but Julia could sense an undercurrent of pain. She shrugged. "It's not about the meal, it's about the principle." Her statement was laced with a prejudice she had never openly confronted. Deep inside, she felt uncomfortable around black men, especially those who seemed to receive public praise or recognition. It challenged her unacknowledged sense of superiority. Daniel looked away, a flicker of hurt crossing his eyes. Yet, he seemed to decide not to escalate. Instead, he took a breath. "I'm heading to Atlanta because my daughter has a medical issue. I'm just trying to be there for her." Julia froze for a moment, feeling the slightest hint of empathy bubble up, but she buried it. "Well, good for you," she murmured, picking at her salad. "Probably another sob story about medical bills or something," she told herself. Silence fell between them. Despite her best efforts to bury the flicker of conscience, Julia could not entirely dispel a growing unease. She glanced at the photo again, seeing Kayla's bright smile. For the briefest of instants, Julia felt something akin to guilt. Then she hardened her resolve. "I'm just being realistic," she told herself. "Not everyone who wears a uniform is a saint." When the plane touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. Flight attendants read off the arrival gate and warned of a rainy forecast. Julia unbuckled, eager to put distance between herself and the soldier she had so brusquely dismissed. She refused to meet Daniel's gaze as she maneuvered into the aisle. As she stepped off the aircraft, she overheard Daniel on the phone, saying, "Yes, Ms. Carter, I'm here. I'll be at the hospital soon." The tone of urgency in his voice nagged at the edges of Julia's consciousness, but she pushed the thought aside. "I have a conference to crush," she reminded herself, checking her watch. Inside the terminal, she strode toward baggage claim, ignoring the hustle and bustle of families reuniting, business people in a hurry, and tourists gawking at the massive airport signs. Her phone buzzed with a text from her colleague. "We need your updated slides by tonight. Big pitch tomorrow. Where are you?" Julia typed a brisk response, glancing over her shoulder once to make sure she wasn't being followed by any well-meaning soldier. At baggage claim, she grabbed her sleek silver suitcase. Just as she wheeled it around, she glimpsed Daniel again, this time on the far side, seemingly still on a call. Something about his lowered head and tense posture tugged at her heart for a split second. Then she shook her head, steeling herself against any compassion that might threaten her carefully curated outlook. "He's not my responsibility." By the time Julia slid into the back seat of her pre-booked car service, rain was pelting the windshield. "To the Harborwood Hotel, please," she instructed the driver. The man nodded, and they merged into Atlanta's notorious traffic. Leaning her head back, Julia tried to focus on the big presentation that awaited her in less than 24 hours. She scrolled through her phone, adjusting financial figures and storyline arcs in her pitch deck, but she found it harder than usual to concentrate. A small but persistent voice in her mind replayed the brief conversation with Daniel, the pained flicker in his eyes, the mention of his daughter's medical issue. No, she told herself. She refused to let that disrupt her sense of order. Soldiers came home all the time with sob stories. Life was tough for everyone, wasn't it? Julia's conference kicked off the next morning in a gleaming downtown skyscraper. The event hall buzzed with chatter about new market strategies, the latest leadership theories, and whispers of possible corporate mergers. Julia circulated confidently, shaking hands, exchanging business cards, and setting up her laptop for her main presentation. She thrived on the adrenaline of corporate success, each handshake reinforcing her sense of power. After delivering her talk, complete with polished slides, statistics, and a measured dash of humor, Julia received congratulatory nods. Her phone chirped, and she stepped outside the conference room to check messages in a quiet corridor. She saw a notification from her local Atlanta news app. Local Army sergeant's child, fighting for her life. Community rallies for support. The accompanying thumbnail displayed a small image of a hospital room. Ordinarily, Julia would have dismissed such a headline, but she couldn't help clicking this time. The article opened with, "Sergeant Daniel Parker, recently returned from a tour overseas, is appealing for help with his daughter Kayla, who has been diagnosed with a life-threatening congenital heart defect." Julia stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. The article included a photo, the same bright-eyed girl from Daniel's snapshot. Kayla was hooked up to multiple tubes in a pediatric ICU. The caption read, "Kayla Parker, age 9, awaits a specialized surgery not fully covered by standard military insurance." Words like experimental procedure and insurance gaps jumped out. Julia found herself reading more closely. The piece reported that Daniel Parker had returned to the U.S. on emergency leave. Because Kayla's condition had worsened, she needed advanced interventions at an Atlanta children's hospital, a procedure so costly that Daniel had started a modest online fundraiser to make up the difference. Julia's heartbeat thundered. Her mind flashed back to her sneering remarks on the plane, her accusations about him angling for special treatment. Shame surged through her. She pictured Kayla's little face, the tubes, the lines of worry etched in Daniel's expression. He wasn't faking anything, she realized, swallowing a sudden knot of guilt. She locked her phone. Part of her wanted to dismiss this as irrelevant to her life, just another sob story. But the image lingered, tugging at the beliefs she'd clung to so tightly. For the first time in a very long while, Julia felt a tremor of remorse creeping into her carefully guarded heart. By evening, the conference's cocktail hour was in full swing. Attendees clinked champagne flutes, swapped business gossip, and exchanged stories about career trajectories. Julia, wearing a sleek black dress, managed her trademark smile for the small circle of executives surrounding her. Yet, she felt a gnawing unease. Every time she tried to engage in conversation about profit margins or Q4 projections, her mind drifted to the news article. Kayla's face, so filled with innocent hope, intruded on every thought. Julia sipped her drink and forced a laugh at someone's joke, but guilt loomed like a storm cloud. Eventually, she slipped away to a quiet corner, near a large window that overlooked Atlanta's dazzling skyline. The city lights shimmered, but Julia felt none of her usual fascination. She pulled out her phone, reopened the article about Kayla, and found a link to Daniel Parker's fundraising page. Goal, $150,000. Current, 37 full. The page showed updates from Daniel and some well-wishers who donated 10, 20, or 100. Each message expressed hopes and prayers for Kayla's recovery. Julia's chest tightened. She was hardly strapped for cash. Her salary and investments allowed for a comfortable lifestyle. Still, she'd never felt inclined to give large sums to strangers. She'd been taught to believe everyone should work for what they have, just as she did. But reading the fundraiser's comments, where Daniel detailed that Kayla's specialized heart surgery wasn't fully covered by insurance, made her see the predicament in a new light. She typed in the donation field, hesitated, and typed again. Am I really about to do this? The thought of parting with a significant amount felt daunting. Yet she couldn't escape the memory of her scathing remarks on the plane. Slowly, she entered 10,000. Her heart pounded as she clicked submit. Immediately, a confirmation popped up, thanking her for her generous donation. She stared at the screen, wondering if Daniel would see that name, Julia Prescott, and recall the woman who had been so unkind. She almost wished there were a button to remain anonymous, but in her haste she hadn't selected that option. Setting her phone aside, Julia pressed her fingertips against her temples. She sensed that the donation, while large, was only a superficial bandage on a much deeper wound. I owe them more than money, she admitted to herself. I owe them an apology. The next morning, Julia woke before dawn, her mind troubled by a restless sleep. She left a note for her conference team saying she'd be occupied with personal matters for a few hours. Then, guided by the address from the fundraiser page, she drove a rented sedan to Peachtree Children's Hospital, a sprawling campus with murals of cartoon animals and bright directional signs. She found herself feeling inexplicably nervous. As she navigated to the pediatric cardiac ICU on the third floor, the smell of antiseptic and the soft beep of machines enveloped her. Nurses in scrubs bustled about, some greeting each other with tired smiles. Julia approached the central desk. "I'm looking for Kayla Parker," she said quietly, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. A nurse scanning an electronic tablet asked, "Are you family?" Julia flushed. "No, I'm a friend, I guess." It sounded hollow. The nurse frowned, but eventually waved her through after calling Kayla's father to confirm. The nurse pointed down a hallway lined with childlike, cartoonish paintings. When Julia reached room 312, she spotted Daniel Parker through the glass window. He stood by a metal-framed hospital bed, leaning over the sleeping form of Kayla, who was attached to multiple IV lines and monitors. Daniel's back looked rigid, as though the burden of the world weighed down his broad shoulders. Summoning courage, Julia knocked softly on the doorframe. Daniel turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Miss Prescott," he said, his voice a mix of confusion and caution. "Didn't expect to see you here." Heart pounding, Julia stepped inside. The room was small, with stuffed animals lining a countertop, an IV stand pumping medication, and a monitor that beeped every few seconds. Kayla lay with her eyes closed, a slight rise and fall in her chest. She had an oxygen tube taped just below her nose. "I read about Kayla's situation in the news," Julia managed, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry if this is intrusive, but I wanted to check on her. And on you." Daniel's glance flicked over her. He didn't speak immediately, but Julia sensed more sadness than anger. He stroked Kayla's hand gently. "She's in critical condition. The doctors say the specialized surgery is our best shot." Julia approached the bedside, her hands twisting in front of her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, feeling tears prickle the corners of her eyes. Kayla stirred, fluttering her eyes open. She blinked twice, trying to focus on Julia's face. Daniel bent down, speaking softly. "Sweetheart, there's someone here to say hello." Kayla managed a faint nod. Julia forced a smile, noticing the exhaustion in Kayla's gaze, the small beads of sweat on her forehead. She reached out her hand cautiously. "Hi, Kayla. I'm Julia. I met your dad on a plane a few days ago." Kayla's voice was barely a whisper. "You're traveling a lot too?" Julia swallowed. "Yes, I came here for a conference, but I wanted to see you. Your dad says you're very brave." A flicker of a smile touched Kayla's lips. I try to be. I'm so tired all the time." Her eyes flicked to the array of monitors. "But I'm gonna get better." Emotions flooded Julia. This girl's unyielding resolve sparked something transformative inside her. She realized that behind her own hardened shell of prejudice, there was a humanity she'd buried. She looked to Daniel, who gently dabbed sweat from Kayla's brow. After Kayla dozed off again, Daniel turned to Julia. "I appreciate you coming," he said softly, "but I'm still confused about what made you change your mind." Julia felt a flush of shame. "I saw the news report about you and Kayla. I remembered how awful I was on the plane. I realized my actions were—" She struggled to find the right words. "Hurtful and fueled by ignorance." Daniel's expression remained guarded. "You were definitely harsh, but I guess that's your choice to make. However, I won't lie. It stung to see someone so ready to dismiss me as if I hadn't earned my place, just because I'm a black soldier." Julia's throat constricted. "I know," she said quietly, tears threatening. "I won't ask you to forgive me right away, but I donated some money for Kayla's fundraiser because I wanted to start making amends. I know money can't fix everything, but I had to do something." For several seconds, Daniel studied her face. Then he nodded once. "I do appreciate it," he conceded, "but Kayla's life isn't a check you can just write. I'm fighting for her every day. Still, I recognize that you are trying, and that means something. Julia bowed her head, his words echoing in her mind. He's right. She could never undo her hurtful attitude in an instant. Real transformation would require sustained effort. Over the next several days, Julia found herself pulled into Kayla's story more deeply than she ever anticipated. Despite her professional obligations at the conference, she spent pockets of time at the hospital, bringing coloring books, children's storybooks, or small plush animals. She tried to distract Kayla with silly jokes or stories of her own childhood. Gradually, Kayla became more comfortable with her. Meanwhile, Julia also discovered that her initial donation sparked a flurry of interest. The fundraiser total climbed as some of Julia's corporate acquaintances pitched in, creating a ripple effect. While she was glad the money was flowing, Julia realized that Daniel also needed logistical help, navigating insurance, dealing with the complexities of hospital paperwork, and organizing potential second opinions. She volunteered, though Daniel hesitated at first. "You don't owe us your time," he said, fiddling with the wedding ring on a chain around his neck. "But if you really want to help, I won't say no." Julia threw herself into the task, channeling the same organizational zeal she used for corporate projects. She discovered Kayla's best chance lay with a specialized surgeon who had experience with rare congenital defects. But the waitlist for that surgeon was painfully long. On a sunny afternoon, Julia stepped out of the hospital's main entrance, her phone to her ear, calling a contact who oversaw special medical approvals. Once, she would have used such connections purely for personal gain. Now, she felt a burning need to help Kayla, not as penance, but because she genuinely cared. In the midst of these phone calls, one of her colleagues at the conference texted, "Missed your afternoon session. Are you all right?" Julia replied simply, "I'm helping someone who needs me." It was the first time in years she'd turned her back on the relentless chase for career advancement. Yet somehow, it felt right. That evening, as she prepared to leave the hospital, she crossed paths with Daniel in the corridor. He looked exhausted, but offered a weary smile. "Kayla had a rough afternoon, but she's stable again." He paused, studying her. "I see you running around, making calls, ignoring your corporate obligations for us. Why are you doing this, Julia?" She took a breath, heart pounding. "Because I've realized you're worth it," she answered softly. "And Kayla's worth it too. Not because you're a soldier, or because I feel guilty, but because you're human beings who deserve help." Days bled into a week, and the specialized surgeon finally agreed to move Kayla's case up the priority list, partly due to mounting public interest, partly due to the hospital's philanthropic arm stepping in. Julia attended a hospital board meeting, leveraging her corporate acumen to advocate for Kayla's immediate needs. She no longer cared if people whispered that she was using power plays. For once, her ambition wasn't about self-promotion. It was about saving a life. The surgery day arrived in a swirl of anxiety and fragile hope. Julia stood with Daniel in the corridor as nurses prepped Kayla in a pediatric surgical ward. They parted ways at the double doors, which led to the operating room. Kayla clutched a small teddy bear that Julia had given her. She offered a brave smile, though tears glittered in her eyes. Julia nearly broke down when she heard Kayla's small voice whisper, "I'll be okay, Daddy. Ms. Julia says I'm strong." For hours they waited in a designated family lounge, Daniel, Julia, and a handful of extended relatives. No one spoke much. The tension was palpable. Daniel clasped and unclasped his hands, pacing occasionally, while Julia stared at the clock on the wall, silently praying. She had never been very religious, but in that moment she'd have prayed to any power that might help Kayla pull through. At last, a surgeon appeared, looking fatigued, but wearing a relieved expression. "The procedure went well," he announced. "We've repaired the defect, and while she'll need close monitoring, the prognosis is cautiously optimistic." A collective sigh of relief swept the lounge. Daniel buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs of gratitude. Julia felt tears spill down her cheeks, an overwhelming mix of relief and awe. She touched Daniel's arm gently. He looked up, teary-eyed, and pulled Julia into a brief, grateful hug. In the days that followed, Kayla's recovery was a roller coaster. Pain management, follow-up scans, and physical therapy. Julia visited regularly, sometimes bringing healthy snacks or fresh pajamas. She'd sit by Kayla's bedside and read bedtime stories while Daniel went to grab coffee or check in with the medical staff. Kayla, regaining her energy, joked that Julia was the coolest grown-up friend ever. That simple label warmed Julia's heart like no corporate accolade ever had. Throughout this time, news outlets continued covering Kayla's story. Both local channels and a few national segments interested in medical insurance gaps for military families. A short video interview featured Julia standing alongside Daniel, describing the outpouring of donations and the process of securing top-tier care for Kayla. Some watchers speculated about a possible romantic angle between the two. But the truth was simpler and more profound. They had grown to respect and care for each other, building a bond that transcended the painful start of their relationship on that flight. Julia's transformation didn't stop at Kayla's hospital door. She began confronting other prejudices she'd harbored over the years. She sought counseling to unpack her biases, recalling how she was raised in a mostly white, affluent neighborhood, hearing subtle but persistent racist sentiments from relatives. She recognized that prejudice had shaped her worldview without her fully realizing it, including her reactions to Daniel Parker on the plane. Though it was uncomfortable, she embraced the need to learn and unlearn, determined to ensure she'd never inflict such harm on another person again. Meanwhile, Kayla's health continued to stabilize. A milestone arrived when a pediatric cardiologist declared her ready for partial discharge. The day Kayla left the hospital, wearing brand new sneakers that lit up with each step, she gave Julia a heartfelt hug. "Thank you for helping me, Ms. Julia," she said with the unguarded sincerity only a child could muster. "I hope you still come to see me even though I'm not in the hospital." Julia's throat tightened. "I promise I will," she whispered, blinking back tears. Daniel helped Kayla into a wheelchair for the final hospital procedures. Then, turning to Julia, he spoke quietly. "I can't repay you for everything you've done. I know it started with a donation, but you went far beyond that. You've been here, fighting alongside me. I'll never forget it." Julia looked at him. "This is the man I once treated with such contempt." She offered a tremulous smile. "Just keep letting me be in Kayla's life," she said. "That's enough of a repayment." The next month felt like stepping out of darkness. Kayla adjusted to a new medication regimen, returning to small pieces of normal childhood. Reading, drawing, even short walks in the park with Daniel pushing her in a lightweight stroller. Julia remained involved, often coordinating meal trains, visiting with groceries, or sometimes just showing up to chat. And for Julia, the corporate world that once defined her identity felt different now, less fulfilling when compared to the real, tangible difference she was making in Kayla's life. She still did her job, but with a new perspective. She began pushing for philanthropic initiatives within her company, arguing that their resources could support children with specialized medical needs. Impressed by her newfound passion, management offered her the role of spearheading a new corporate social responsibility program, something she never would have pursued before meeting Daniel and Kayla. One cool autumn evening, about 3 months after Kayla's surgery, Julia found herself invited to a small barbecue at Daniel's aunt's house on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was a modest place with a roomy backyard, where Kayla giggled with cousins and occasionally stopped to catch her breath, mindful of her still healing heart. Daniel's extended family welcomed Julia with open arms. She was the only white person in attendance, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt gratitude radiating from all around. Seated at a picnic table, nibbling potato salad, Julia watched Daniel show Kayla how to toss a soft foam football. Kayla tried, but the ball wobbled. She laughed so hard that she had to hold her chest carefully, worried about the scar from her surgery. Daniel gently guided her arms for another throw, and the ball sailed a few feet further this time. Their shared laughter filled the yard. Julia closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the scent of charcoal smoke and freshly cut grass. She remembered how it had all started, her hateful remarks on the plane, the assumption she'd made about a black soldier in first class, the harsh words she'd flung. If I hadn't taken that flight, if I hadn't read that news article. The thought was too enormous to fully process. Fate, luck, destiny, whatever it was, had brought her face to face with the ugliest parts of herself and, somehow, also given her a chance to change. Later that evening, as the sky dimmed and fireflies blinked around them, Kayla settled next to Julia. "Can we read a story?" the little girl asked, eyes gleaming. Of course, Julia said, retrieving a slim hardcover from her purse, a fairy tale collection she'd found at a local bookstore. She read by the soft glow of a porch light, her voice weaving magical scenes of brave princesses and loyal knights. Kayla listened intently, leaning her head against Julia's arm. Daniel stood nearby, arms folded, occasionally glancing over to see if Kayla was okay. He caught Julia's eye and mouthed a silent, "Thank you." In that moment, Julia felt the final pieces of her old self slip away. She recognized the depth of this new bond, a soldier who'd risked his life for others, a little girl who refused to surrender to her illness, and a woman who'd at last confronted her own prejudice and learned what it truly meant to help others. In the following years, Kayla continued her slow but steady recovery, each checkup delivering improved results. Julia split her time between her corporate role, now aligned with philanthropic endeavors, and volunteering with various organizations that supported military families and children needing specialized care. She became a vocal advocate against systemic inequities, determined to address not just her personal biases, but also the broader societal factors that made people like Daniel Parker struggle to get help. The guilt that once gnawed at Julia gradually transformed into a gentle, persistent motivation to do better, for Daniel, for Kayla, and for countless others she would never meet. Though she could never rewrite the cruel words she'd said on that plane, she hoped her actions could speak louder. In time, Daniel, Kayla, and Julia became something of an unconventional family, tied together not by blood, but by gratitude and the choice to stand by each other in life's toughest storms. And so, a seat assignment on an overbooked flight, once an encounter marred by prejudice and contempt, became the beginning of a powerful tale of redemption, compassion, and shared humanity. Proof that even our worst impulses can be overcome by the simplest truths: empathy, honesty, and a willingness to change.